Sorry it's taken me so long to get out this second part on of three on Graham Oppie. Uh, Analyzing some of these interviews can be pretty daunting. In this case, it was actually pretty easy, but it's just kind of got lost in the shuffle with everything going on. Um, and I decided to ultimately keep this one kind of short. It doesn't require a lot of analysis. The first thing is this: if you're an atheist or a Christian and you want to really know atheism well, I have a feeling this book would be really good. I have not read it. I'm basing this on the interview and what I've discovered so far about Graham Oppie. I'll tell you this: if a conservative Christian seminary had a comparative religions course, although he wouldn't qualify because he's not a Christian, he could easily teach um, a comparative religions class. Having taken a comparative religion, more or less, at a seminary, I'll tell you the way he studies these issues. I'm going to put a link in the description of the interview with him. Are very similar to the way we studied them in school. In fact, in school, we read James W. Sire's book, The Universe Next Door. And I would not be surprised if Graham Oppie's read that. His views, particularly from an academic sense, are very similar to Sire's, and from the way seminaries teach this. And you can also see why academics don't like to debate people that don't have a certain degree of education. Because if you watch the Unbelievable podcast, no, not Unbelievable, that wouldn't be fair, but just to be honest, if you watch some of these atheists, we're going to say village atheists, but if you've paid enough attention to YouTube, you probably know who I'm talking about. They sort of start in on this. The first thing they want to do is shift the burden of proof. Graham Oppie's not interested in doing that at all. He's interested in comparative studies. And that speaks volumes for him in terms of objectivity. I don't think any of us are objective, but certainly the effort's there. It is clearly there. And that should go a long way with you, whether you're a believer or not. Now, on the interview that I'm posting, if you don't have thick skin about people who are opposed to Christianity, this interview may not be for you. This is by atheists for atheists. But I'll tell you, if you watch this and you get easily offended, I question whether you're in the world and not of the world. You probably need to be watching things like this and need to be hearing the other side. And I'm going to hone in on one factor in this interview. There's much more that could be said about it. But finishing my opening thought, this book, An Introduction to Atheism, Christian or not, will be a good book to read. You'll learn a lot about, I believe, things that really bother atheists. And in this particular interview, there's something brought up that I'm like, I imagine that would be very annoying. Again, I think you should study that. You should watch the interview if you're easily offended by someone who doesn't agree with Christianity. I think you need to do that. I think that, first off, I don't think the interviewer or Graham Oppie are offensive in any way. They just side with their position. And Oppie's even objective in this interview. I think he's more objective than the interviewer, to be honest with you. And I think it's obvious too, by the way. Not that the interviewer was not bad at all. He was fine. He was completely inoffensive, but he's an atheist and he's promoting that position, and that's what his channel is devoted to. And so if you're going to watch this, you should have thick skin. Okay. There was something that was said that was very interesting, and I thought this would be fun to talk about. I'm going to keep it brief. I'm still not going to let this go over. I'm going to try to keep it under 8 if possible. But one of the things that the interviewer brought out that's in the book, apparently, is he says, I don't, and this was among many things where he asked Graham Oppie just kind of respond to what he was saying. And he was saying, Graham, he said, are you angry at God? And I thought, I imagine that would be really annoying constantly, because you could just tell by the way they were talking, this is something they have to deal with all the time. Or you're angry with God. I've never told an atheist that. I think that's kind of a really silly thing to say to an atheist. But I'm gonna unpack that a little bit and analyze a little. But Graham Hoppe said something very interesting. He said, well, yeah, why would I be angry at God? I don't believe there's an Easter bunny, so I wouldn't be angry at him. Now, if you have any history of sort of layperson apologetics, a red flag might go off there. But I want to tell you that you should be careful with that. The red flag would be, well, there's a difference between, God and the Easter bunny, which is absolutely true. But that would be misunderstand what Graham Hoppe's saying here. What he's saying is that his belief that he has in God is equivalent to belief in the Easter bunny. That's very different than saying that from the sort of the village atheist position of the Easter bunny and God are univocal, However, I want to unpack it a little bit because it's kind of interesting. Every worldview has an inherent right to analyze its opponents. And one of the things that those who would say that, they should not, as an apologetic, say that to an atheist, unless they're asked, why do you think I would reject God? What do you think my psychological state is? They're probably not going to say anything like that, but let's just say that conversation came up. You might be able to say something like this. Well, the thing with the Easter bunny is that the Easter bunny obviously wouldn't challenge your moral proclivities, things that you would do that would be considered moral or immoral. Certainly, Graham Hoppe has experienced shame, would be a good example. Like what, in a naturalist position, that might be, which, by the way, is not necessarily, let's not pretend like naturalism and atheism is all exactly the same, or that all forms of atheism are the same. There are differences, for sure. But, some atheists or some naturalists might say, well, ultimately, I believe that's just a chemical reaction in my brain, right? And of course, that's being challenged by theism and saying, no, it's actually something beyond that, something beyond culture, and so forth. The other thing is that the Easter bunny obviously wouldn't challenge atheistic cosmogonies, whereas, a theistic position in God would. And those things could potentially have a big psychological weight on the person that's opposed to that position. If that makes any sense. And so that's still, I'm not presenting that as an apologetic. I'm presenting that as an internal analysis of non-theistic views. And we, as Christians, have a right to do that. You go to Romans, and they address Romans in this interview, which is really interesting. It would be like this. Let's just say an atheist says, look, the reason why you accept God is out of fear, right? We've heard this before. That's a potential atheistic position for the psychology of the believer. You have a fear of there not being a God, and therefore you embrace the idea of God. And they have a right to have that analysis. And so, so I would say this. An atheist could be angry at God, quote unquote, reject God on that basis, and there still not be a God, right? That's why it's not a good apologetic. Just like it's not a good apologetic for an atheist to say, well, you fear that there isn't a God. I could fear that there isn't a God, come to believe in God, and there still be a God, right? And so that's the kind of thing I thought would be a really good example of why this book would be very good, because it would identify things that you may think are great arguments that actually aren't. And if at the very least, watch the interview if that sounds like something you might be struggling with. Okay, I haven't selected the interview for part 3, but I think I have one in mind about the foundations of reality, and I think that's going to be really interesting. It may take a little while to get back to that one too, because that's going to have to really be, I'm going to have to do a lot of study on that one to offer a critique or even just a regular examination. Have a good one.